Great.
Okay, good. Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you for the introduction. I'm really delighted to be participating, but disappointed to be online. I got a text message at 7:30 a.m. saying that our babysitter for the day has COVID, which is very apropos. So I'm relying on the great babysitter of the pandemic, Netflix, to keep the kids occupied while I'm here virtually. Okay, so this presentation, I'm not a health law person. I'm a tech law person, and trying to think some big thoughts about where we've been with COVID. And where is this all going in terms of the use of digital technology to combat infectious disease? So I think COVID can be characterized as the first sort of pandemic of the digital age, where we have, the widespread adoption of all kinds of digital technologies in society, right? So again, briefly explore the two main technologies that I think were used to combat COVID, right? Digital contact tracing and digital vaccine certificates, and then think about what happens if we start applying those technologies or other similar technologies to fighting other infectious diseases. So pandemics have a long history, right? We've had many outbreaks of pandemic disease really since the agricultural revolution. And, it's really in the last couple of 100 years that we've developed great techniques to combat them, right? Vaccination being a sort of a medical measure, obviously, and contact tracing. I think, Professor Fissman's presentation yesterday sort of talking about, cholera and the beginnings of the germ theory of disease, right, in the 19th century. So, we've had these techniques for a while. What's new with COVID is that they've become digital, right? We've used the supercomputers in our pockets to automate these. So there's been a really robust discussion throughout the pandemic on the relationship between the right to privacy as sort of a key human right in the use of these technologies vis-a-vis the right to health, right? And we can also think about this in terms of other human rights and balancing them, the right to free movement, to free expression, etc. So, right, there's my graphic of the debate that we've had, right? A lot of discourse, and some of it is Tower of Babelistic, certainly in the political realm. But this discourse takes COVID as a constant, right? We're judging the privacy implications of these technologies and the other implications against a particular disease. So what I want to do in the paper and the presentation is sort of make this constant into a variable. So everyone knows about these technologies, but I just want to unpack them quickly and sort of think about what's salient about the use of technology to combat COVID. And I'd like to introduce the concept of affordances, which kind of comes from science and technology studies, but it's also, we see this a lot in the law and technology literature. So an affordance is basically the question of, how does a feature, a design feature of a technology facilitate a particular kind of behavior, right? And we can think about the affordances of cell phones, of smartphones, right? These are supercomputers in our pockets that have three key technologies that have been leveraged in the pandemic, right? One is the fact that these are cellular communication devices. The second is Bluetooth technology that allows devices to communicate with each other short range. And of course, the fact that these have cameras. So contact tracing, right? I'm going to quickly go through these in order to illustrate my point about technology more generally. So, there's two basic variations of automated contact tracing or digital contact tracing that were used in the pandemic, right? One is based on cellular technology. So by design, the network operator of a cell phone needs to know where it is in order to provide signals as you move. So your location can be triangulated by your Rogers or Bell or Vodafone or whoever it is to figure out where you are. And in the earliest days of the pandemic, this property was leveraged to engage in some contact tracing, right? So on the left of this slide, you have what's called a tower dump, which is if you go to a cell phone base station, you can see who's connected and what the relative signal power was to that tower, which can be used to triangulate locations. Now, Korea especially leveraged this technology in the first few months of the pandemic to engage in a sort of contact tracing. There are different variations, but they usually either involve using sending emergency alerts saying so and so has COVID, you may be near them, or in a more sophisticated way, figuring out who else was in proximity using this triangulation data. And sending it to them. And here's an infographic from the CBC that sort of shows that. Now, the key thing about this form of digital contact tracing is that it involves centralized data collection. And so here's an interesting paper that sort of analyzes the Korean experience. It's centralized. So you need somebody to sit there and sift through the data and say, Jane Doe has COVID. Here's their location. Let's go and look and see who else is around them, right? So you're aware of people's locations and you're aware of their identities. And there's significant issues with this. I mean, it's easy to deploy. It doesn't require developing a lot of new technology. It just requires data analysis, right? But there are lots of critiques of this, including significant false positive problems because cell phone triangulation can't tell if there's a wall between two people. That would mean that they're not sharing the same error. So, of course, Apple and Google developed their contact tracing solution that depends on Bluetooth, right? So the idea is that when two devices with Bluetooth are nearby, they're exchanging information about signal strength, and using some brilliant encryption technology, they created this system by which you could share these calling cards, which kept changing over time to sort of with other people in proximity. And let's just sort of stipulate that they did this great bit of design to really preserve locational privacy and anonymity. So when you got an alert from COVID alert or something that you're been exposed to COVID, there's very little, almost no chance of you reverse engineering the information to sort of figure out who it was that exposed you, right? So this is fantastic from a privacy perspective, right? It's location unaware. It's a decentralized approach. It preserves the anonymity of users, but of course, it's difficult to deploy, and there's lots of questions around the effectiveness of these technologies. Very quickly, going through the same analysis for vaccine certificates, right? We have the same kind of, two dominant approaches, right? A centralized and decentralized approach, but also a question of what do we encode in the passport, right? What's the information that is in the QR code? And then the question of how do we verify it, right? So again, we had centralized versus decentralized verification strategies and different approaches to data retention when the certificate is shown. So China, with its health code system, right? Now, of course, these are not vaccine certificates per se. They're kind of a variation on them because they encode other kinds of information, such as positive test results and quarantine information. But this is an identity-aware, location-aware, and data-retaining system. The South China Morning Post has this great video that shows, like, what does it look like to use these things in China, right? And basically, when you go into an establishment in the country, you sort of show your QR code to a scanner that then retains the fact that you have entered that place, right? So there's centralized data collection that can be used for all kinds of purposes, contact tracing for sure, but we're talking about an authoritarian state where the former head of state was kicked out at the party congress this morning by his successor, right? So one can imagine the possibilities of mischief that you could, do with this vast collection of data that's happening in a place like China. By contrast, in most sort of global north countries, the vaccine certificate system was designed to encode minimal data, right? Your name and maybe what you got. And the verification system was decentralized, right? So in Canada, for example, when the apps were used to verify your vaccine certificate, they never pinged some central database. They used some fancy mathematics to be able to determine, is this a valid certificate? Much in the way that if you go to the grocery store and pick up a $20 bill, you can look at security features in the bill to tell if it's counterfeit or not, right? So this is sort of an anti-counterfeiting system that didn't involve centralized collection and retention of data. Okay, the point that I'm trying to make here is that we started at the beginning of the pandemic with these things in our pockets, and they had certain kinds of features, which were then leveraged by designers, by governments, by others to build out two key public health technologies. But the design choices had very different impacts on human rights. We can see that across vaccine certificates and across contact tracing, right? So this is where I'm going to sort of make my pivot, which is that COVID has been a constant, right, in these conversations. Now, of course, COVID is evolving, right? We know that it's evolving very, very quickly, right? And here's sort of the graphic of the different lineages of COVID and showing, the rate of genetic change. But it has some features that have been relatively constant, right? Aerosol-based transmission. We now know that it's not spread by fomites, so forget the hand sanitizer. Aerosol transmission, right? It's an airborne disease that has some impacts on stigma, right? It's one thing for a disease to spread by sharing the same air. It's quite different for a disease to spread by some other vectors. More on that in a moment. And low stigma. People post their test results on social media saying, I have COVID, right? And it's not seen as a greatly stigmatizing thing. Infectiousness, right? I know the scientific folks here have debates about what's the reproduction number, et cetera, but it's within a certain kind of range in terms of the level of infectiousness, as compared to other diseases that are much more transmissible, like measles, right? We also have questions of how severe is COVID, and it's a serious disease, right? I think the notion now that COVID's over, let's party, obviously ignores the fact that this is causing enormous amounts of mortality and morbidity, right? But it's relatively constant as compared to other kinds of diseases. So here's a little thought experiment, right? What if we think about the deployment of either COVID-related technologies or other things that are made possible by these things in our pockets or on our wrists to combat other diseases? What if we do something with syphilis, for example, right? So let's just play that thought experiment for a moment. And I'm going to draw some legal and public policy implications from that at the end, right? And I apologize, this feels like a Black Mirror episode for those of you who are familiar with the show. I feel that's like a lot of my job is like Black Mirror-esque in terms of thinking about what could possibly go wrong with these technologies. But all right, well, syphilis is an STD, obviously, right? And that has some serious implications about how we combat it, because our sexual lives are perhaps some of the most private things that, in our life, right? And there's a really great emerging literature around sexual privacy as a, particularly important field of privacy, right? One which is the closest to our biographical core, to use some of the lingo, right? That also has impacts on the stigma of disease, right? So our sex lives are obviously very private. The law recognizes that, and sexually transmitted diseases are highly stigmatized because they tell us something about our, other people about your sex life, right? And there's literature on this too, right? I don't think people post their positive STD tests in the way that they do with regard to COVID or respiratory illness, right? And then we can ask those questions about infectiousness, severity, how treatable it is. And syphilis is obviously treatable if detected early. Other STDs, are less treatable, right? Or other bloodborne pathogens, okay? So let's just imagine that there is a vaccine to combat syphilis, as there is for HPV, right? And of course, there's a lot of work on other vaccines to combat other STDs, right? And now let's imagine we sort of deploy this technology stack to combating something like syphilis, right? Now, when Colleen, Brian Coven, and I were working on some of our papers, we always chuckled a bit that the Ontario regulations on vaccine certificates included strip clubs, bathhouses, and sex clubs. As a kind of category of place where one would be required to show that you had a vaccine certificate, right, in order to participate in those events where places where, well, you can imagine what happens there. So let's just think about, the desirability of imposing some kind of similar requirements if we had vaccines for STDs on places where high risk sexual behaviors occur. Would we do so by automated means, right? So we chose in COVID not to use automated means of vaccine certificate verification. We chose like having to use QR codes, but one can use a technology called geofencing. So I just I have reminders on my phone, buy milk. So when I drive by the Loblaws grocery store on my way to and from work, my phone will tell me when I'm within 50 meters of the store, hey, go buy some milk, right? One could imagine doing the same thing with regard to entry to a place where we think high risk sexual behaviors are going to occur. Or for any other disease, right? We think about the vector of transmission and where in society those kinds of things are going to happen, right? So we can ask some public policy questions about that. We could even confront the distressing possibility of having, automated notification with regard to people engaging in sexual behaviors. It's crazy to think of it, but with wearables, it is either possible now or maybe soon possible to tell what exactly a person is doing, right? And there's some, anecdotal literature about this with regard to wearables and, the use of accelerometers and other technologies to determine when someone's having sex. And, this is happening in animal research right now, where, they're using wearables to determine when animals are mating, right? So sounds crazy, but the point I'm trying to make here is that I don't think anyone foresaw in 2019 that we would take technologies in our pockets and use them in a particular way to combat this outbreak of disease. So a few key questions I think we should be asking is, should the law require the use of these tools, right? Do we mandate the use of these kinds of tools to prevent certain kinds of infectious diseases? Should the law permit the use of these tools if private actors decide that this is what they want to do? Or should we have prohibitions on the use of certain kinds of digital tools to combat certain kinds of diseases, right? And if the answers to our questions are one or two, what kinds of design requirements should the law impose? Because the law and tech literature teaches us that technological design is a form of regulation, right? That is often extremely sticky, right? So the takeaway here is that, the same technologies applied to different diseases are going to result in really different balances between privacy and public health and really other social values too. So I would say that now is the time to channel our Rodin and to start thinking about this. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Krishnamurthy. That was an amazing presentation for walking us through these very challenging technologies and understanding them better. Can I ask Dr. Veale to take over now?
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks for that great presentation previously. And I'm hoping to build on parts of that going forward. Let me just move my screen around because it'll rejigs as soon as you start sharing your screen. So thanks, everyone. I want to talk, zoom in particularly on the verification aspect that's been raised already a little bit and touch upon it. The kind of context here is that I work at UCL Laws, same as Jeff in the previous panel. We'd been involved heavily in a project that led to the Apple-Google exposure notification system in the discussed previously in contact tracing panel called DP3T. And after that, there was a lot of discussion around vaccine passports, vaccine certificates. And following the work we've done in Bluetooth contact tracing, many people turned to our international group and said, are you going to be the ones that are going to make a privacy-friendly version of this? And some of the reasons that we decided against going in that direction are things that I'll lay out in this presentation and in the work that's been shared as well with the participants of the conference. So this panel seems to be moving much more from pro versus anti to working out what we're actually talking about when we talk about vaccine passports and vaccine certification, which I think didn't get as much critique and discussion in the general debate that was happening as they were emerging as it could have done. We've talked around the International Certificate of Vaccination and Prophylaxis already. The carte jaune, the logic of it, of course, was around yellow fever and avoiding the transmission of yellow fever in countries that could be vulnerable to it due to vectors that are specific to those places. But as the COVID pandemic emerged and progressed, the narrative around the yellow card was that it was easily lost, it was prone to fraud, and it shouldn't be forming the basis of vaccination certificates as they're used internationally or domestically. So in Europe, the Commission's e-health network was told to design a certificate with verifiability as a key design criterion, and we saw similar dynamics with the WHO's Smart Vaccination Certificate Working Group, although that was also tempered by the position of the WHO on vaccination passports and international travel. So there were some tensions going on there. So this was the idea of having verifiability as a key design criterion, avoid fraud, stop people being able to write something into a document. And the digital pass is not always what people think it is. So I've separated them out here, what a digital pass is versus an analog pass. And that doesn't mean, it's not the same as a paper pass versus a digital pass, because digital infrastructures can be exhibited and used in paper form. So we're not talking about whether it's paper or app, we're talking about the depth below the verification system. And we see in Germany, for example, in the German vaccine certificates here, many people got these and got them printed out without having any apps or any websites or any emails recorded about these. So it was a digital pass, even though it was fully on paper. And that contrasts with the situation in countries like the United States, where the record card was used to record the actual event of vaccination and used to transmit that going forward, and the same as the concept behind the International Certificate of Vaccination or prophylaxis. So we tend to ignore these, and we ignore the depth below the iceberg when we analyze them, and it was ignored quite heavily in the political debate. And these are really important questions, such as how would countries know that a certificate issued in another country is valid? How do vaccine events and the identities linked to them get entered into this system securely? And does that differ across countries? How is that recognized across countries? How, if at all, can certificates be deactivated or revoked? Revocation is one of the hardest things to do in the secure design of computational systems. It is not to be taken lightly, and it really failed in a major way in this pandemic in many countries. What if one country has concerns about the validity of vaccines in another country and the fraud associated with their certificates? How do they react and navigate those tensions? And also, how is the infrastructure to scan the documents, often through mobile phones or other devices, built, secured, and maintained? And that comes with its own set of issues. For example, if those devices are recording the certificates that they're scanning, then that creates entirely separate sets of concerns. So the iceberg of a digital technology is much deeper than the QR code itself. And I argue here that digital certificates in the pandemic were structurally insecure. And actually quite deeply insecure and unavoidably so. And this was quite apparent before they were deployed and before they were designed, that they were going to be this way. Firstly, we saw the direct international acceptance of unverifiable analog cards. So 12% of Americans, according to a poll from YouGov and The Economist, under 30, admit knowing someone with a fake vaccination card. In Germany, there are currently over 12,000 prosecutions over fake cards issued there, and that number appears to be growing. We saw that there was a huge political pressure to accept, for example, US travelers into other countries, and because the US had decided politically to not place a vaccine database, then it created a need to accept analog cards internationally. And I think probably Pedro will talk about the international health regulations as well in this context a bit, so I don't want to go into that further. But we saw other problems in this chain. So if we're talking about security and verification, it's all well and good to verify whether the thing that you're showing on your phone or on paper is a valid QR code, but did the vaccination event behind it ever actually happen? So we saw the use of analog cards here to populate digital databases. In Germany and many other countries, for example, the US, the paper record was used to sign that the vaccination event had happened, and effectively used to sign that that vaccination event related to that particular individual. So doctors didn't have a role particularly in verifying patients. You know, the logic of a huge vaccine rollout was not that the doctor would refuse to vaccinate a patient if they didn't show an identity document or a passport or something like that. So that actually event at this point, when huge numbers of people were involved in the vaccination effort, meant that almost everybody has the ability to record a vaccination event across the world that is recognized. And that system had to be quite open-ended, otherwise it was incompatible with a mass rollout at speed. We then saw these analog cards be used to populate the informatics systems. So that was in two ways. the conversion of international certificates as you moved across borders if there was a domestic requirement. But also in Germany, for example, the system was that you would get your yellow card signed by a doctor at a vaccination point. Usually, at least for many people, this would be how it worked. You would take it to a pharmacy, and a pharmacy would look at the yellow card and input it into the database, therefore laundering any fraud that had happened earlier on with the yellow card. This was further compounded by illustration, particularly by the German newspaper Handelsblatt, about how easy it was to set up a fake pharmacy, because pharmacies themselves had a decentralized structure. They had to roll out this verification and this sort of conversion functionality at scale. And so pharmacies themselves were given rights without proof that the pharmacy even existed. Handelsblatt registered a fake pharmacy using photos from the internet in a residential building. And at this point, it was, we can see why these numbers in Germany for prosecution are perhaps so large. And this is just one country. So we then saw that as soon as you've laundered these analog credentials, you could have these internationally recognized. And this is why the black market for vaccination certificates thrives pretty easily for digitally verified ones. Furthermore, many countries have no ability to revoke certificates that they're issued without revoking the certificates for everybody in the country. And there are some cryptographic reasons behind that and some reasons that relate to the nature of the design of those certificates. Some countries like the UK didn't go for revocability at all and just let them expire every 30 days. That's probably a more sensible system, but it requires that every 30 days, people have a way to re-download them. And that requires that digital link to a database, which, as I said, in places like Germany and the US didn't exist. So at this point, actually, if you wanted to make a vaccination passport with your name on that went, give you a green tick at any point internationally, it was a pretty easy thing to do. And it was a pretty easy thing to do without being caught in this regard. Now, forgery and fraud of this is a criminal offense. There are many things that are easy to do that are also crimes. And that's an important point to remember. And this is not an anti or pro-vaccination passport discussion that I'm presenting here. We can say that vaccination passports are a great thing. But in that case, we would have to ask whether you are trying to get uptake of these passports and trying to avoid fraud by convincing people that there is some techno magic that is going to catch them if they're going to forge these documents. So this is a sort of verifiability theater. As this technology did not really secure vaccine passports from fraud from even pretty low motivated individuals, then this techno magic behind this was seen as increasing adherence. And really, instead of doing what the computer scientists would design it to actually create a secure system, it was a form of theater that is meant to make people believe that the system is secure. Now, that may be a justifiable idea, apart from one fact, that these systems actually do real things in the world. Deploying an infrastructure that allows people to verify and validate attributes about themselves to other people, including private actors, is not a trivial decision to deploy and not a trivial infrastructure to implement. So considering the Canadian context, issues of function creep around the ArriveCan app. ArriveCan app, designed initially as a useful tool to help collect information out of the quarantine app, seemed to move into becoming a mandatory tool to create to collect such information, into being expanded and in the ideas from the federal government into creating new border-related features that could change the border experience for the better. So you move from a system designed just for a public health purpose into a digitization of critical public infrastructure without having legitimacy debates or discussion around what kind of borders that we want. And bordering doesn't just happen at borders. So bordering is a process in which people can have documents checked and have status checked within countries and at other points as well. And we've seen in the UK that this can cause real injustice to people's lives through the hostile environment immigration policy and the Windrush scandal, where many people, particularly from the West Indies, were told that they had no right to remain despite having lived legally in the UK for nearly half a century, effectively because they were never incentivized to get certain documents, and then those documents became mandatory to check them, and they had no way to continuously prove their residence and their legal rights to remain, and indeed British citizenship, if they wanted to take it, which they sometimes didn't. We also have the concept that immunity is less relevant, and we saw this in the previous panel, than transmissibility to border protections. And transmissibility is not a status that relates to an individual, but an individual in their context, their behaviors, it may relate to certain parts of the individual, but not only. And this opens the door to various types of demographic or behavioral profiling if we want to take this technology to its logical conclusion, or for future pandemics, which might have less favorable characteristics around transmission that we could be concerned around. And I think that Vivek talked about that well in his presentation. We also have the rest of the world. Cryptographic systems are expensive and they're really difficult to maintain. And they rely on health informatics infrastructures that simply don't exist in some countries. So countries fearing that they would be excluded from international travel had to rapidly install systems. And these systems were often installed by the private entities that were involved in the standardization processes, for example, in the EU and at the WHO level. And it's great to never waste a good crisis, because these private entities get unprecedented opportunities to create path dependencies in these countries to extract value and reconfigure their public health systems. It's rushed procurement without the public sector having a real idea of how to digitize, because they're doing it for a set of criteria that are not related to the broader health context around how they might want to integrate health informatics in the future. And we have to reflect on why organizations are pushing verification strategies and validation tools when we can see that they're not going to become secure within this pandemic for the reasons I've outlined. And largely there are going to be private reasons behind that. Coming to the end now, I want to reflect on why, if privacy solves this at all, the answer is really no. Compared to the contact tracing situation, while the narrative around vaccination certificates was heavily on creating confidential ones that they didn't reveal things accidentally to other people, that's important but pretty mundane. It's actually pretty technically simple to develop a vaccine passport that only shows the relevant information to the relevant person, and indeed it's legally required if that's not impeding the functionality. The core functionality, though, is twofold. A way to say I am the person I say I am, that's identity attestation. And a way to say the person I say I am, or the identifier that I've now attested to, has the characteristic I want to attest to. These are two different distinct stages that happen in validation. And you can do some of this, at least with attribute-based credentialing. So there are ways to say, hi, this identifier has certain characteristics. I'm going to prove that to you, but I'm not going to prove which vaccine I had, or was it prophylactic, or have I recovered, or something like this. I'm going to prove that I meet your criteria without telling you anything more. That's cryptographically possible. But it's a lot harder to work out that you are the person you say they are. So this typically got dropped domestically from almost any context. But at borders, we have passports that are going on here regardless. But the question is this functionality endangering privacy? Well, I think the six of Brian's talk, next to Vivek's talk here, the creation of low-cost proof infrastructures to prove attributes to private actors who don't usually have the ability to verify those kind of things is something that can be expanded and misused, and it can exacerbate digital divides and structural injustices, and something we need to have a debate around more than just rolling out without particularly having much of a solid technical foundation for it. And at this point, it's pretty interesting to see that this, what this means in terms of privacy. Well, this is certainly for the broader theoretical notion of privacy as control of your identity, physical privacy, privacy in a much broader context does really, that right does have something to say about this situation. But confidentiality, the technical design of the system, is really something you can both have this functionality and confidentiality at the same time. And so there's this sort of technical distinction which confused the debate around privacy quite significantly. So to conclude, there's been huge effort in verification infrastructures being built. When vaccine passports were thought about to begin with, computing experts and companies rubbed their hands and said, great, we could design some of these, let us at them, we'll help you build standards. But the security behind those standards was inevitably going to be limited by the need that you're vaccinating everybody at scale as rapidly as possible. And that is really the primary public health need. So most impacts were behavioral from this rather than relating to the security features of the technology. And that leads to proportionality questions. Behavioral interventions, on one side, versus the deployment of infrastructures just designed to encourage those behavioral interventions that had side effects in the world. And legally, proportionality analysis deals very badly with the installation of infrastructures that are not being immediately used. It doesn't really trigger obvious rights and freedoms. It's more of a longer pervasive discussion about what becomes more slippery and less friction-filled for a government, state, or a private actor to do in the future. So these infrastructures, they lay the real foundations for certain digital futures. They allow others and they preclude others. These are political discussions, and they're not discussions that we had deploying these infrastructures, which, as I say, were behavioral in nature. And that may be a valid public health thing to do, but the other side of the discussion around these digital infrastructures was not discussed. Now, this would be different than if I was using paper-based or everyone had the American system moving around. That wouldn't have these same considerations, and of course that is what we effectively have in many ways. So if you want to read more, I wrote a paper on this with colleagues Stefania Milan, Lynette Taylor, and Seda Gursis, and it covers some of these. And of course, I'm expanding on it in a paper for this conference. So thanks to my colleagues helping me think through this. And there is an obligatory COVID-era QR code to that paper that you can scan, as you all love to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Veale. Lots of food for thought generated there. I'm sure we'll come back with questions after the when we open the Q&A. Pedro, can I turn it over to you to walk us through the normative duality of goods and persons in international law? Please go ahead.
Yeah, very gladly. Thank you, Rujin, and thanks to the organizers of this wonderful conference for the invitation to join such distinguished scholars and colleagues whom I admire. And yeah, I will now proceed to share my screen, please. The usual procedure. Give me a second, please. I trust you can see it, and then I will begin the slideshow. By now I should do this more smoothly, but I'm a slow learner. So as Rujin kindly mentioned, I will address this normative duality that we seem to find in international law, public international law, I might emphasize, with regards to how the cross-border mobility of persons is regulated vis-a-vis the cross-border movement of goods, and with an emphasis on vaccine passports, of course, as the phenomenon we saw throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, and a reflection of this a tilted and a lopsided process of global vaccination, where, of course, mobility to and from some countries was at a disadvantage whenever in these countries the vaccination rates were lower. And again, I will focus on the international dimension. Previous panelists have already addressed what happens at the national level, and we have a wonderful paper by Colleen Flood and Brian Thomas on exploring the different aspects under national law and human rights, and Michael already referred to some of these vaccination certificates with regards to the possibility to conduct certain activities in our daily lives. But what happens then when these vaccine passports, and well, vaccine passports I use also as to refer to other means to demonstrate either immunity or prophylaxis against diseases. What happens when these are imposed between different countries? What do we see? And I'm speaking in a very broad manner because, of course, due to issues of time, I won't go very much into the details, into the nitty-gritty legal details. But I will then start by giving an overview and the main claim of my contribution to this conference and to the future edited volume, that there's a general normative duality, first on how international law addresses the movement of goods and how it addresses the movement of persons across borders, I may add, and across international borders. And this applies generally and specifically on the cross-border spread of disease. And this is, again, the focus of today. We can have a much bigger discussion on the process of globalization and how international law norms on the cross-border movement of goods are much more sophisticated and are much more accepted than the ones on the movement of persons. And this has to do with political reasons. I'll come back to this. But on the one hand, we have, of course, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the World Trade Organization, and particularly the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement, which regulates the the movement of goods across borders, and particularly with regards to how to protect what states may do under the claim of protecting against the spread of disease through the movement of goods. And by goods, I include as well animal products and plant products as well, but it's mostly animal products, and particularly with regards to the risk of zoonotic spillover. Right? And as we have it's been a longstanding awareness of how globalization and the increased movement of persons and goods across borders have as well become an accelerator for pandemic risk. And in the case of goods, we do have a legal regime dealing with the perils, or let's say the risk of the posed by the cross movement of goods, particularly with regards to zoonotic spillover. Zoonotic meaning, the transmission of a disease between a non-human animal and human. I'm oversimplifying, of course. And on the other hand, we have, with regards to the regulation of the movement of persons across borders and how states may impose certain requirements with the justification that it's for the protection against the cross-border spread of disease. Here we have the international health regulations. And I won't go as much into details because we, of course, have previous presentations, particularly by Lisa Foreman, on how the international health regulations address this issue. And it's mostly focused on Article 43. For this purpose, I can refer to a wonderful piece by Lisa Foreman and Rujin Habibi at International and Comparative Law Quarterly, which go very much in depth into how this article has been understood and how it's been applied during the COVID-19 pandemic. Needless to say, it's not the first time that this article has been at stake. We have had other instances of disease outbreaks where states have imposed travel restrictions, so restrictions on the movement of persons across borders with the justification that it is to protect public health against the cross-border spread of disease. But in very summarized terms, what both of these regimes try to do, and in here I will put them together. I speak of normative duality, but I'm glossing over many distinctions, but what these two legal regimes try to do is to ensure that the restrictions on the movement of goods and the restriction on the movement of persons with regards to the cross-border spread of disease or the risk of the cross-border spread of disease are necessary, are not more restrictive than what is necessary, and they are proportionate. That states somehow do not use the justification of protecting against the cross-border spread of disease as a means to really avoid their international law obligations. In the case of the cross-border movement of persons and the case of the international health regulations, this is also part of a whole system of incentives that the international health regulations try to give states in order to share information, right? To have these authorities be forthcoming when sharing information about events occurring in their territories that are related to communicable diseases. Because otherwise, of course, if a country, and as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, if a country shares information under the international health regulations, this is a different obligation, related to a communicable disease outbreak occurring in the territories or a disease-related event. It doesn't need to be a new outbreak, a disease-related event occurring in the territories. So when they share this information, particularly with the World Health Organization, this system of incentives tries to ensure that they will not be subjected to unnecessary restrictions on international travel or trade. But as we have seen, both throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and in past outbreaks, this system of incentives does not always work. And I would argue that more often than not, it doesn't work. States nevertheless impose restrictions on both international travel and trade whenever they find out that there's an outbreak occurring in another country. And the question, the the balance that these regulations try to achieve and the incentives that they try to give is, well, why would these countries then report those events? And what incentive can there be for those countries to report those events if they will then be subjected to such restrictions? And so there will be a strong incentive for them not to share any information on this matter. But, well, with regards to what exactly can be legally done, let me move this. I know it's blocking the visualization. So what do we see then with regards to international cross-border mobility of goods and persons, and why is this comparison apposite for the subject of today? Well, let's imagine, and of course, pardon my very rudimentary depiction. So we have a border, and with regards to goods, and particularly animal-derived products, we have import or export, depending on which perspective you adopt, which is regulated under GATT-WTO law. So the law within the General Agreement on Terrorism Trade and the World Trade Organization, which have a very sophisticated set of rules that will determine how, when these products arrive to a border, and that these products will be reviewed and will be examined by customs authorities, usually. So what can these customs authorities do when they check whether these products are safe? But we also have, in the case of persons, whenever these persons mean to travel across borders, and by travel, I do need to clarify that these international health regulations apply for travel strictly defined and not for the purpose of establishing residence. This falls outside of the regulations. We already see a big gap in the regulation of the international mobility of persons. As Jeff King was alluding to in the previous panel, we have a big issue with regards to the movement, the international movement of workers, right? We either temporary workers or more permanent workers who move across borders in the current economy more often than we actually realize. But most of the times, these persons fall outside of the purview of these regulations because these regulations were not designed with these persons in mind. They were really meant to regulate travel in a very strict fashion, in very limited fashion. But what these regulations nevertheless try to do is to address how exactly and what criteria will migration authorities can adopt when reviewing, the health status of these persons. And to let them know, again, travel and trade occurs not only on a more general basis and not just at a more general basis. We're not just speaking about communicable disease control, but I'm focusing today on communicable disease control as a reasons for restricting imports, exports, and travel across borders. Keep in mind, of course, that these two are much bigger phenomena with regards to imports and exports. We have many other reasons why trade can be restricted. And similarly, with regards to travel, states can restrict it for multiple other reasons. So to mention briefly one example, we have seen how in the wake of the Ukraine war, several countries have quote unquote sanctioned Russia by imposing multiple travel restrictions from persons coming to and from Russia. And this falls outside of the purview of what I'm addressing today, but nevertheless, these are as well travel restrictions. And states, at least prima facie, have a sovereign right to regulate such travel, and unless, of course, there are agreements in place that establish a set of rules meant to guarantee that travel will take place without such restrictions. And I'll come back to this point later. But, well, on the one hand, what can either these customs or these migration authorities request from goods and persons? In the case of persons, and I, of course, introduce here the old school, we have about 3 minutes, okay. The old school certificate of vaccination or prophylaxis. or they can request a health certificate for exports. What will be the requirements under international law that will be expected from these documents as a condition of entry, right? Meaning if a good or a person does not show these certificates, right? If importers, exporters don't show the certificate for goods, or if a person doesn't show the certificate for vaccinations or prophylaxis, they may be refused an entry into that country. And this is, again, legal. But if we look at each of these certificates, under GATT WTO law, the legal question that will be posed is, are these requirements really necessary for protecting public health? And the onus will fall mostly on authorities imposing those restrictions to provide the evidence, right? And to justify, well, we need these certificates because these products might be dangerous in case they are, at risk of spreading, causing a zoonotic spillover. And in the interest of time, I won't go deeply into the details of this case. It's a complex case involving India and a ban on poultry products from the United States after an outbreak of low pathogenic influenza was reported in the United States. Long story short, India lost the case because it couldn't demonstrate that these restrictions on trade were necessary to protect the public health of not just the health of the possibility of this avian influenza spreading across poultry, but also to protect against the risk of zoonotic spillover, meaning that this poultry could then cause avian influenza to further spread. Whereas with the certificate of vaccination or prophylaxis, we may have the yellow book that Michael Veale already mentioned previously, but we also have the more modern version, depending on which one is at stake. And countries may make them a condition of entry, including for diseases not listed in these regulations. These regulations have some diseases, mention some diseases, but of course, COVID-19 was not known to mankind by the time these regulations were approved. So they may be required for new diseases, but there is no international case law on how countries should impose vaccine passports as requirements. At the most, as Michael already referred to, we have WHO guidelines. And before COVID-19, it should be noted that only a handful of countries required yellow fever vaccination certificates as a condition of entry, meaning those persons that did not show these certificates could be refused entry to that country, and this was legal. And poliomyelitis, vaccines against poliomyelitis were also candidates, but this was still under discussion due to the reemergence of polio across multiple countries. Okay, so we already see now a normative duality here in case we have disagreements on to what extent these certificates are necessary. Let's say, countries disagree on whether these import or export restrictions are, particularly import restrictions, are actually proportionate. In case, authorities simply choose to refuse the import of particular products because they consider them to be dangerous. Well, we have the WTO dispute settlement system, which is one of the more, one of the more sophisticated and one of the most successful, I might say, international law dispute settlement systems, because there's a compulsory jurisdiction, and states can simply resort to this system whenever they disagree with these other, with the trade policies and trade restrictions adopted by other countries under the justification that they're protecting public health, animal health, or plant health. With regards to disproportionate travel restrictions under the international health regulations, there is simply no case law so far. There was we almost had one dispute in the 1970s because of disproportionate travel restrictions imposed due to a cholera outbreak, but this never made it to the court, actually. And we currently have the Permanent Court of Arbitration as the jurisdiction, the judicial forum, in case states have a disagreement on whether travel restrictions are actually necessary, but no case has ever been presented at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And we do have domestic courts that might, in theory, review the legality of these travel restrictions, but these, of course, often have limited standing for travelers. Right? Let's say a traveler is affected in his or her rights because he or she is refused entry to a country. Well, what standing can this person have? And I do cross-reference here to the, to Lex Atlas COVID-19 that Jeff already mentioned, where we're looking into some of the few cases that emerged whenever travel restrictions were imposed, which again, I'm happy to discuss further later. But long story short, domestic courts are also, a very limited judicial forum in terms of really providing an opportunity to travelers to contest or to challenge restrictions. For example, whenever vaccine passports are not accepted and because of the format, or because this person simply disagrees with the fact that he or she has to show a vaccine passport as a condition of entry to a country. We see already a limitation here in comparison to the mobility of goods across borders. And what about the momentum for change? We saw now after the COVID-19 pandemic an unprecedented degree of restrictions on travel and trade, on both. What will international trade look like after COVID-19? We see at the WTO that there was a global supply chains forum with the disruptions to the global supply chain continue to this day. And not all of them, of course, are due to restrictions imposed under the justification that it was to protect public health against the spread of COVID-19. Sometimes it was simply a factual issue. Sometimes it was simply that, companies were unable to export particular products or particular materials because of the disruption that COVID-19 caused altogether. But there are multilateral debates, and there are indeed concerns of how to ensure that countries can continue to conduct international trade even in the middle of a pandemic, and including having a clear understanding of the rules that apply whenever a restriction on the import of goods is imposed, so that COVID-19 or other communicable diseases are not used as an excuse to impose unnecessary restrictions on international trade. But what about international travel? And here the picture is a bit fuzzier, but there is something on the way. We had debates at the bilateral and regional level, particularly on the Schengen area, right here in the European context. We do have an agreement that guarantees the free movement of persons, and that guarantees the gradual removal of restrictions on the mobility of persons across territorial borders. On the other hand, we do have the possibility to amend Article 43 of the regulations, which is again the one that establishes that states shouldn't impose disproportionate restrictions on travel and trade, but let's focus on travel in this case. And countries have submitted multiple amendment proposals, and I will actually defer to the chair of this panel, Rujin Habibi, who happens to be a member of the International Health Regulations Review Committee that will be tasked with assessing the amendment proposals submitted by multiple countries. I haven't seen them yet, not all of them yet. And I am not aware of whether one of these proposals will actually entail, reforming the particular provision that has to do with international travel during a cross-border disease event, and to what extent states may impose those restrictions. So we will have to wait until the report comes out. No pressure on Rujin, by the way, and her role on the IHR Review Committee, but they will prepare a report that will then be submitted to the WHO and the World Health Assembly in particular, in order to discuss whether this can be what we saw during COVID-19 will operate differently in future similar events, and whether international travel restrictions under the justification of the protection of public health, including the obligation to show vaccine passports, will have a clearer set of rules for future events. This remains to be seen. So to conclude, And I have a few analytical claims that, of course, I will still need to explore further. And I argue that this reflects a two-phase globalization process more generally. I realize that Kylie Lee is among us today, and she has written extensively on what this means for pandemics. So in light of what we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, there's more impetus to address the cross-movement of goods so far than that of persons. Again, pending the amendments to these regulations that we will see in the upcoming months. Possible reasons, until today at least, and again, my hypotheses may be wrong in case we do see an overhaul of these rules. Oh, we should note that there's the cross-border, the nature of cross-border communicable disease outbreaks is a sporadic one. If we compare it to trade relations between states, which is on a more permanent basis, on a more constant basis. So that's why even before the COVID-19 pandemic, actually, we already had a few instances where these vaccine passports were required. But so that might explain why this impetus was simply not there, and we'll see if it's there now to really come up with a more harmonious and substantive system of regulated international trade during pandemics. But it might also be related to how countries have, of course, a core interest in expanding trade volumes as a matter of economic development, particularly export heavy countries like Germany, where I'm currently at. It's a matter of public policy to ensure that international trade is stable, something that does not operate the same way with regards to the cross movement of persons, even with the caveats that Jeff mentioned, that a lot of workers have to move across borders, and these also contribute to economic development. But it's simply that this, and this leads me to my final claim, and it's simply that the cross-border movement of persons is politically more sensitive, more generally related to migration. You can imagine, and in the debates we see currently in the political arena, migration is a toxic debate, and that is polarizing societies to, I would say, to a much deeper extent than international trade. But of course, it's not that international trade is politically isolated, not at all, but it's simply that migration has historically been a more sensitive area for sovereign interests, and that's why we see these two-phase regulation of each field. Well, I thank you very much for your attention, and apologies if I exceeded my time, but I will be more than eager to continue this discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Villarreal. I also want to say I apologize in advance that I think in the beginning I had a slip up and I said Pedro. It's only because I know him very well and he's a cherished colleague. So yes, thank you so much for that presentation. I have a question in the chat that I want to pose first, if that's okay, before we turn to a few more questions in the room. So the question in the chat is that there was a lot of fanfare about the potential for the COVID alert app to prevent diseases and therefore save lives. However, post-mortem on the COVID alert app has suggested such a modest benefit as to question whether it was even worth its significant investment. My first question is, what considerations would you recommend during the development and dissemination of these types of surveillance apps to protect privacy while also significantly increasing the benefit? Secondly, what thoughts can you share about how the voluntary or mandatory nature of the adoption of these apps factors into the effectiveness at disease surveillance and prevention? And this is open to anyone to answer. So please go ahead, Michael, please.
Yeah, can I come in there? Because perhaps I've probably been the most involved in the development of those particular types of apps. We particularly started this in Switzerland and then had to sort of handhold Apple and Google through their adjustment and deployment of our protocol. I think every country looks at their own context. One thing, they weren't typically well integrated by governments into their own health systems. Some countries did do that. So actually in England and Wales, there's a very interesting paper in Nature by colleagues at Oxford University that indicates that there was significant impact of the application in England and Wales, averting perhaps 8,000 deaths on a statistical modeling approach. But that doesn't mean that was the case everywhere. There is a specific context for this, and that's important. And I'll point, if people want to learn more about the context and the way these apps need to be properly integrated, we've actually just written a paper around this very recently that's in Communications of the Association of Computing Machinery, called Deploying Decentralized Privacy Preserving Proximity Tracing, where our big international team that sort of led on the protocol development reflects on the needs for this. And these are things we were hammering on about in 2020 when it was happening, deploying test codes, integrating, promoting these things. And what I'll push back against, though, is there is a narrative which is just sort of functionally incorrect and not backed up by evidence, that it was the privacy and confidentiality preserving aspects of these systems that created low adoption or limited effect in countries. That's not backed up by what we see. It's the lack of integration in the healthcare system that really stood in the way of this. And most of the functionality people say was possible through less privacy preserving systems was actually possible in the systems that with supported development and deployment too. They just didn't ask or weren't really aware. So yeah, lots of things possible, but it's lots of postmortem to be done internationally.
Thank you so much, Dr. Veale. Does anybody else want to take a stab at this question, or?
Yeah, I'd like to come in on that if I can.
Please.
So a couple of things. I think in terms of the increasing benefit, it's hard to tell behind the veil of ignorance, right, if these things are going to work. So I think the integration point that Michael made is important, but we also, we were designing in a crisis. And it's hard to know exactly how useful the tools will be until they're deployed, right? But the other question to ask is sort of, on voluntariness versus mandatoriness, right? So most governments made, and certainly the platforms, the mobile operating system manufacturers created a default that these systems would be switched off unless they're affirmatively switched on by the users and they downloaded the local app, right? In other countries where they use a much more invasive form of contact tracing based on cell phone location data or GPS data, the default was that you were in, right? Like it or not, we were going to use your location information for public health data. So that raises some really interesting questions around privacy and what some of these defaults should be. Should the default be, when we have a pretty strong privacy preserving technology, that users should be opt-in unless they affirmatively opt out, right? We can ask all those kinds of questions, and we can also ask that, as my presentation sort of raised the specter of using that with other kinds of diseases, right? Which may transmit in a different way. So I think the better way to think about this is kind of a matrix approach, right? And think about, what are the different variables that we have, and where on that matrix do we want to be? Or an XY plot, or whatever else you want to call it. Whatever your visual representation is.
Great. Thank you so much. We have a question as well from the room. Stephen, please go ahead.
You can hear me? Oh,
yeah.
Great. I was just going to say, Pedro, it's great to see you. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. I know that you were deferring to Regine for good reason on about changes to the international health regulations, specifically Article 43. This, of course, is at the core of so much debate that's happened over the last 2.5 years related to how we globally govern infectious diseases on our tiny blue dot in the universe. Wanted to get a sense from you, though, what kind of changes do you think the world should make as the world is discussing revising the national health regulations? It seems like, well, as you know better than probably anyone in the world, that was a key linchpin in the negotiations of revising IHR in 2005. In many respects, it's listed as it's the 43rd article, but often the one that's viewed as one of the most central aspects of that legally binding instrument. Any thoughts on what changes should happen, and then the downstream implications if the changes maybe unsettle the grand bargain that the IHR represents? Thanks, Pedro.
May I, Roshan, then?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stephen, and good to see you again. And likewise, I'm very grateful for the question. And again, I will, if I were one of those states submitting amendment proposals, if I could have that possibility, what would I do? Well, it is indeed. I should clarify. These amendments will be compiled and then submitted to the first to the Director General, if I understand, from the WHO Director General, and then to the World Health Assembly, which will then choose which ones to accept and which ones to not to accept. So it might be that we see something entirely different. But if I was, to sneak in one of the amendments, what would I personally like to see, right? This is my personal opinion. So what we have seen with Article 43, which, by the way, I consider to be the most convoluted provision of the entire regulations, and with understandably so, because it's the one that tries to achieve a balance on how states exercise their sovereignty during the cross-border spread of disease with regards to travel and trade, mostly travel, because for trade we have the WTO. And, to me, it's clear that this system of incentives, in the sense that states would have some assurance that they will not be subjected to disproportionate travel restrictions whenever something like COVID-19 happens, and whenever they report or other states find out that there's a disease with a cross-border potential spreading in a country. So states would, I would assume, and we saw this when South Africa reported the Omicron variant, and the international communities, several countries, not the whole international community, several countries responded by imposing travel restrictions to South Africa and neighboring countries. And I assume that, these countries do want some more certainty on what, that this system of incentives will actually work. So one idea I've put forward previously, but I know it's ambitious, is, well, let's say that states will often disagree on what is proportionate and when these travel restrictions are necessary, particularly when the evidence is inconclusive. In most occasions in the past, travel restrictions, according to the evidence, have been deemed to be counterproductive. In the case of COVID-19, there are multiple qualifications on whether travel restrictions are effective. But to bring it to close, states should at least have the certainty that they will receive some sort of compensation, for example, whenever these travel restrictions affect their economies considerably, and that the damage that these restrictions cause their economies will somehow be taken into account whenever this happens. This can be through financial mechanisms. Maybe it doesn't need to be inserted in on Article 43, that that the international community should somehow take into consideration these travel restrictions imposed targeting particular countries. But this would be, in an ideal world, again, that we would see this incentive system work more effectively than it currently does. I know I took too long, sorry, but I had my own views on that. Thanks so much, Stephen, again, for the question. I'm happy to expand on other ideas, but in the interest of time, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Villarreal. We have another question in the chat. Do we have one more, maybe a few more minutes? Okay. So it's a question for Pedro. It's proposing a reason perhaps for which international law has more strict application to human mobility. And the reason they propose is perhaps that the threat of trade is lower in infectious diseases, and other public health risks are generally well known and manageable. Would you agree with this?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I see it's Luciano Botina. I take it. Thanks so much, Luciano. Yeah, well, that would be one hypothesis, although it has been, I do wonder though, we're speaking of risk and in terms of international trade, sure, we have an entire complex infrastructure meant to ensure that products are safe. We do have this. But nevertheless, I would, on the other hand, point to several reports that indicated how, first, zoonotic spillover is the main has been so far the main cause of these disease outbreaks. And international trade is still, nevertheless, can enhance that, particularly wildlife trade, right? This is one area where it is particularly, the risk has been pointed out in multiple reports, including those by the one health high-level expert panel. But let's take it nevertheless. I'll take your point, Luciano, that other public health risks are whether this can be a reason for international have a more strict application to human mobility. It may also be related to how I didn't mention this in my presentation. As I was referring to these communicable disease outbreaks with a cross-border dimension, what had been more sporadic, and actually during the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century, we witnessed a dramatic decrease in the burden of disease posed by communicable diseases. This is related to the epidemiological transition. So it might be an explanation of why, for example, although in the past we needed much, maybe we need more vaccination certificates when we wanted to travel, this eventually became more and more obsolete with some exceptions. So there was something of, related to how international mobility of persons was less present, and therefore maybe states didn't feel the need to regulate it. But I still would like to keep the other hypothesis active, that it's simply that states in general don't want to regulate the international mobility of persons, because again, you can imagine what happens in multiple countries where and whenever the issue of migration comes up, the issue of mobility of persons comes up. It's a political hot potato and nobody wants to touch it. And, we see unfortunately, some trends in the opposite side of really, becoming more restrictive more generally, and not just with regards to communicable disease control. Thanks so much for the question. I know I'll take too long to respond.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. Thank you. I wanted to wrap up this panel by just first thanking everyone, all of our panelists, especially for their really insightful, comprehensive presentations. I want to emphasize that this panel seemed at times a bit disjointed in the topic matter in terms of talking about operationalization of vaccine passports, but then talking about harmonization of standards across borders. And it's actually not that disjointed. And that's the conversation that we need to move forward. I think coming out of this panel is, so we see all these issues and all these considerations with designing vaccine passports, with the reasons for which we want to design vaccine passports. Is it behavioral? Is it effectiveness? Is it public health? We need to unpack all of this, but is it all happening at the international level? And I think that's the question that is really up for debate and bears a lot more analysis. So thank you for starting us off on this journey, and I really appreciate the questions as well from the room and from the online audience. Thank you so much.